Lakeside is pleased to sponsor this exciting broadcast featuring Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy on Voice America.
Welcome to Creating Presence with your hosts, Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy. Over the next hour, you'll learn about the processes that steer our hearts and minds and how to improve our collective social health.
Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Yanosy.
Hello, everyone.
Sarah and I have developed an organizational intervention for a whole system to help organizations integrate trauma-informed practice. And to organize that, we use the word presence as an acronym. And it stands for Partnership and Power, Reverence and Restoration, Emotional Wisdom and Empathy, Safety and Social Responsibility, Embodiment and Enactment, Nature and Nurture, Culture and Complexity, and the 30 is Emergence and Evolution. In this podcast, we're looking at each of the letters in the acronym with people who know something about the subjects that we're focusing on, and hopefully expand everybody's thinking and all of our work to improve collective social health. The N, as I said, in the acronym stands for Nature and Nurture. So today we're going to take a deeper dive into that topic with a social health focus on development.
Child development is very important in my world, both personally and in our Creating Presence work. I actually have 5 little ones, all under the age of 5 in my home as of last night, between biological kids, adopted, and foster kids. So I am living child development. And this work is also really important in our thinking around creating presence, because we work with a number of early childhood education programs. And we're going to focus on issues around nature and nurture. And that really is going to be looking at attachment. Attachment forms the foundation of our ability to relate to other human beings. And that comes from the sort of beginning of our capacity for empathy. And empathy and compassion are formed in our brains in early childhood. I think sometimes about horses. Why do I think about horses? I think about horses in comparison to humans when I think about development. Because what's so striking to me is that when a horse is born, within minutes of coming into the earth from its mother's body, it is up and walking, and shortly after that, running. And humans are so different. Human babies take, I think most of us would say, about 25 years to develop into full adulthood. And the process is so much slower of meeting some of those milestones. And that means that there's a lot of opportunity because our brains are growing and developing over that really long stretch of time for good things to happen that enhance our brain development, and also some really scary bad things that can disrupt our brain development. And if we're exposed to toxic stress in early childhood without the buffering of love and nurturing, that can really make for some very serious brain development problems. But it's not just risky because young children can be exposed to trauma or toxic stress. It's equally risky if their primary attachment figure is exposed to toxic stress, because that gets communicated and translated through the parenting. So I said that we work with some early childhood programs and our consulting work with Creating Presence. And so we focus a lot on trying to teach staff how to buffer stress for children. how to teach parents to use social support to buffer themselves and their children, and also to teach staff members how to use brain regulation and relational skills to buffer themselves and each other. We also do a lot of work with clinicians, and that work also requires us to support them in recognizing trauma bonding and the various ways that trauma shows up in relationships. Sometimes that's reenacting trauma with other people in their lives. It affects how we relate to authority, whether we trust others, and also even whether or not we ourselves are trustworthy. All of those foundational things happen in the early phases of our brain development.
Yeah. And, I was just looking up research about what happens during the prenatal period because I realized I didn't know much about that. There's not much conversation about it. And what I found out was really very disturbing about what they're discovering about the impact of stress on that the mother is experiencing and the impact not just on the mother, but then on the baby and the person that person becomes as an adolescent and an adult. So, and that made me think about how little attention is paid in our entire culture to the well-being of women, much less pregnant women. We seem to forget all the time that the children are the future. So I'm really glad that we have on the show today two people who have spent most of their lives focused on learning about and teaching other people about child development and making that learning really accessible and make sense. So I'm glad they're with us today.
So we are excited to welcome one of our guests, Diane Wagenhals. She is currently the program director for the Lakeside Global Institute's educational network. And throughout her long career, Ms. Wagenhals has been an elementary school teacher, a childbirth educator, a family therapist, and founder of a parenting education company. She's authored over 35 courses and workshops and served as a fellow with Dr. Bruce Perry's Child Trauma Academy from 2010 through 2021. She's a founding board member of the Washington, D.C.-based Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, and that's a national nonprofit organization that advocates for political involvement in changing the landscape of how we support and fund programs that impact children and families. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I'm excited and I love the topic. I can't wait to dive into it. Thank you.
We're also happy to welcome our other guest, Suzanne O'Connor. Suzanne served for 18 years. I know she looks much younger than that. It's not possible, but she did. As the Early Childhood and Trauma Initiatives Manager, and then the Director of Education and Senior Advocate for Trauma-Informed Care for the United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. And she now serves as Director of Trauma-Informed Early Childhood Education for the Lakeside Global Institute, where all of those workshops that Diane has created are actually offered. So I urge you to look at the Lakeside website. So welcome, Suzanne.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's jump in.
Hey.
We understand that neural pathways in brain development and the foundations of relationships and attachment are formed between the ages of 0 to 3. Tell us about what's going on inside the child that makes this period so important.
This is a time of probably the most rapid growth in the brain. And even, before a baby is born, I know some of the people out there that do the research, and they do sometimes the research on their own children, have learned that if they sing certain songs to children who are in utero, when that child is born and they sing this song versus some other song, the child recognizes it. It's like they are learning from early on. And I know some of the research says one of the brain parts, the amygdala, is operational at 7 or 8 months. Learning, that's the part of the brain that often decides if something's fearful and they need to do the fight, flight, all the things to be protective. It's actually functioning. So when we look at the scope of the first 3 years, it's also the time that the baby is developing. That is it's so critical. And what happens then is it actually impacts what happens for the rest of a child's life. One of the things that, as you mentioned, attachment is this concept. It was a Dr. Bowlby who was one of the first ones to study this. I had the opportunity to meet him. He's passed away, but his brilliance in explaining that he watched children on playgrounds, actually. That was the way he started it. He watched them and he saw how they would look at their parent for permission to do things. And when the parent ignored the child, it created anxiety in the child. And so through that, he started to do this research on what attachment is all about. And other people have picked up on that and have come up with 4 categories of attachment. And Sarah, I know when you were talking about these young children that you have, you might even think about what you see, what you observe in them in terms of attachment. The first one, the one that you want, is the securely attached child, who has the sense of I belong here and I'm safe and protected and I don't have to be fearful. Then you can have insecure, preoccupied, where a child is anxious and very self-critical, and just has not learned how to be self-loving. You can have insecure, avoidant, and fearful, which is disorganized attachment when they were a child. Just really, the world was crazy. Which, Sarah, when you were talking, I was thinking about how that might be in some of those little people. And then there's an insecure dismissing, where that's a child that becomes a loner, that just really has had to separate away from people. And they have similarities, but those 3 types of insecure attachment are important to know. And just kind of figuring out, when you are interacting with children, what promotes healthy attachment and how can you repair that attachment. And then for all of us, for people who are listening right now, you can be thinking about, how secure has your attachment been in your life? What kinds of things contributed to whether you are more secure or any of those insecure attachments? And it's, and of course, trauma, when we put trauma in the picture, the sense of fear that creates, anxiety, loneliness, issues around abandonment. So I think, as you may be thinking, one of the things we say in our workshops and trainings and all, you take this stuff in first for yourself. We encourage that, because then it makes it more real for who you are, and you can own it more. So anyway, those are some of the attachment thoughts that I thought I would share. I'm wondering, is there a comment or a question that you have about that?
No, but I was wondering if Suzanne has something she wants to add, particularly around the issue of attachment and trauma.
Sure. And I think this is really important for the field of early childhood, is that childcare teachers, in particular, your infant and toddler teachers, are attachment figures. And according to children's brains, staff aren't staff, they're family. They don't understand that they're getting paid to take care of them. And, the field has come a long way, but one of the problems is that we've really tried to make an educational case for childcare. And for kids, they're not going there to learn, they're going there, to be loved and to play. And childcare staff play a critical role in a child's attachment development. They can be a secure buffer, and make sure that their levels of stress don't go too high, and they're trained to know how to de-escalate and how to support children. So I think that's what, early childhood providers and parents have in common is they do have an alliance. They should have an alliance around a child and talk about these issues.
That's the
And
way we originally evolved, right? In
Right.
large family groups where everybody was grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, brother, sister.
Everybody was there.
Right.
And it's
Everybody
such
was
an
there.
important job. And yet, especially in our country, it is not one that is well compensated, well respected,
Right.
just like parenting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in general, just our culture, we have a belief that children don't remember. What happens to them when they're little, they don't remember. Just keep them, physically safe. If they're in the high chair all day or watching TV, well, they're not getting hurt. They're physically safe. And I think we have to broaden our definition of safety.
Absolutely. Emotional safety, psychological safety, cultural safety,
Yes.
relational safety.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for taking us off with these comments. And we want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, we'll continue our talk with Diane Wagenhals and Suzanne O'Connor about nature and nurture. And we'll be right back after this message.
If you would like your organization to be aligned in its values, practices, and skills to be trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and trauma-resilient, Creating Presence is the program you are looking for. The Creating Presence model is an online and coach certification program authored by internationally renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom. This program is designed to help your organization become certified as a safe and value-aligned place for both your staff and clients. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, the host of this broadcast. For more information as to how your organization can create presence, go to creatingpresence.net. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. Sandy, Sarah, and their guests will discuss strategies and innovative practices for restoring our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy, and we're talking with our guests, Diane Wagenhals and Suzanne O'Connor, about social health, understanding the importance of development, of nature and nurture in all of our services. So I'd like to know, we were picking up from where we were. We touched on the issue of trauma and adversity and how much that affects children. Can you talk about a little bit about how the effect of transgenerational experience from parent to child, from grandparent to parent to child? I mean, goes back, much of this trauma and adversity goes back maybe thousands of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And there's an illustration that we use in our training that is pretty interesting about some of the research on seeing about transgenerational legacies, things that get passed on. And it was some research done, I believe, in England, where the researchers took mice that they had in metal cages. And what they did was they had the smell of apple blossoms permeate the cage. And this is cruel, but meanwhile they had electric shocks to their little feet because it was metal bottom. And afterwards, like Pavlov's dogs, they would put the apple blossom smell, and they didn't even have to put the electric shock. These mice would react. And they knew that it meant hurt. They let those mice have babies, grow up, nothing happened to them. Another series of babies from them, now these are the grandchildren of the original, then the great-grandchildren. They went 4 generations. They took those mice, and when they put them in a situation where they could smell apple blossoms, these mice freaked out, where regular mice did not. And they were learning how the mice, and then there's been other studies about how much who we are has to do with what happened to our parents. And I think that illustrates, we don't even know sometimes that the person that we think we are here is actually somebody that's from, what happened when they were growing up. And I just think that's so powerful. And there's so much unknown when you think about that. So
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think what people don't, when they hear that, they go, you mean my genes have changed? And well, no, it doesn't look like it's actually not your DNA that's changing. It's really your markers on your DNA that
right.
changed. It's called epigenetics.
Exactly.
And that those can change back with
Yes.
proper care, right?
Yes.
People can unlearn those really hurtful things that happen, but not
You're
easily.
not destined.
Right.
It's not your destiny, but it is something to be very aware of, because you have to work at it. We talk a lot about how you change your core beliefs sometimes that are imposed on you from the time you're little. One of the things, Jane Stevens, who started the ACEs connection, later now it's called PACES connection, this just grabbed me because I have a trauma history like many people in this work. And this was enlightening to me because I could relate to it, that the beliefs that you can carry, she lists 4 of them, that people that have been impacted by trauma. And then when you think about parents, if they're walking around with these beliefs, the first one is I was born bad. Included in that is I have no worth. I do not deserve to experience love, safety, relational connections. So that's one of the beliefs of how I was born bad. The second one, I caused others to treat me. This is my fault. The egocentricity of the child, but I'm the one that's responsible for how I've been treated. And then I should have known how to behave. This is that, I should have had enough self-discipline not to do bad things. And finally, I'm always going to be this way. There's no hope for me to change. When you think about children who come into this world and are traumatized, these are beliefs that they carry with them. And they may have inherited them from parents and grandparents. I kind of blows my mind.
Hmm.
How about you guys? Is that?
Suzanne.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the same thing for childcare teachers.
Yes.
We're imposing our own beliefs and values. Are we even aware of these things? I don't think we even thought it was important before. But our engagement in kids really does depend on our emotional health, and our core beliefs.
Yes.
So
And we, as a
what-
whole culture, we have some really negative core beliefs about human nature
Yes.
as a whole.
Yes. And they wound children. One of the things I learned from you, Sandy, from your book, Creating Sanctuary, that's stuck with me and I think is so important, is when you differentiated for people who have been traumatized, that they were not born bad, they're not bad, they're not sick, they're wounded.
Right.
I think when we think of ourselves, if we can say I was wounded, we think of children who are struggling, to say it's about being wounded. And you treat somebody differently if you think of them as having been wounded versus being either sick or bad.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those critical things. And finally, and then I'm going to pass it on to Suzanne, or in the neurobiology of we, which Dan Siegel created. It's a series of actually it's CDs. It's fabulous. He said the single best predictor of positive outcomes for a child, meaning that the child is emotionally healthy and primed to thrive, is not what is often cited. So the question for you is what is the one thing that helps a child, prepares the child for a positive outcome? And he says that, being raised in a home where children can achieve strong and healthy attachment, that's important, or where parents come from strong and emotionally healthy roots, that's important, but that's not it. He said the single most critical factor is the response to the question, how does this parent make sense of their life?
Mm.
When you think about it, especially if you've had a trauma history, have you made sense of your life? Have your parents made sense of their life? And when that happens, that's what he says is the predictor of health in the family. I just so what does it mean to make sense of your life? It means that you need to have a narrative. You need to have your own story. And it's not just a story, but it's really how you have made sense of what has happened to you and what has that meant to you. It needs to be a coherent narrative. And I think he's the one, I guess several people talk about this, but having a shattered narrative where it's all fragmented and you can't put your own life story together, can be the antithesis of this making sense of your life.
Yeah, and Diane, one of the things that gets in the way of doing your own work is those loyalties
Yes.
that you have to your family and to your parents. To do that work might, cause a little dysregulation to think. But then what you always say, and I think what we say in this field, it's what happened to them as parents. They were doing the best that they could, but we're still incredibly loyal.
The
Sure.
force of loyalty is so powerful for us. It's an invisible force, but Naj is the one that I learned that from, that, how do you break loyalties? The legacy of loyalties is really powerful. Sandy, you were going to say something?
Well, just when you think about the 20th century and what families have been through, and, everywhere, not just here, but, the issue of war in a number of generations, taking away fathers, death of parents. I mean,
Yeah.
it's huge. And people forget that doesn't just go away. It's there. It just may not be consciously there.
Yes, but it's a force. It's an invisible force. And I know Naj talked about if you're going to try to break these loyalties that someone has, you don't just talk about. In fact, he said, don't talk about what their children will need. Talk about what the grandchildren and the great grandchildren, because somehow by skipping to do you want to get clearer and healthier so that your grandchildren and great grandchildren don't have to deal with what was in your family, break the family legacies. I thought that was brilliant. I was like, okay, so when you think about future generations, go a few generations forward. It's a motivator.
Sure is.
Yeah.
So, what do parents and other caregivers need to know in order to mitigate some of these risks for the children that they're caring for?
I think one of the things that we teach a lot is child development stuff. What's normal? What can you expect from a child? So your expectations are in line with what a child is capable of doing. And people ascribe motives sometimes, that child's doing that because they want to hurt another child. That's why they're grabbing that. No, they're too egocentric. That's not, me and acronyms, but one of the acronyms we say that describes children is that they lie. It's not about not telling the truth, which sometimes they don't tell the truth, but lie stands for they lack judgment, they are impulsive, and they are egocentric. So if you want to explain why did a child just do something, pause and say, do they really have the judgment? Does a 2-year-old have judgment? Probably not. And combine that with impulsivity and that they do things for themselves. When parents can understand the nature of children, they become less critical of the child. Sure, you have to discipline, you have to figure out what you're going to do, but you do it from a place of, you're just being a child. This is what children do.
And I
And
think parents need to understand it's about, like you said in the beginning, it's about the brain isn't finished wiring.
right.
It's like trying to turn the electricity on in a house when all the wiring isn't in place. It's not there yet.
It's not there yet. And how can you insist that wiring be there? I have a question for you. This is a quiz. If you think about the adult human brain has in about 100, between 80 and 100 billion neurons. And all of these neurons have to be connected to other neurons. And the connections, there's sometimes like anywhere from, I forget, several thousand connections can take place. It's mind-blowing what's going on in the human brain. But this researcher, Dr. Richard Reesake, said that we can calculate that neurons must be generated in the developing brain at an average rate of more than 250,000 per minute. An electrician delegated the task of wiring the circuit, all this circuitry that the brain is, so the brain can finally start to function in these first couple years. If it was 1 per second, here's my question. How long would it take for that electrician to complete the job? What's your guess?
I don't do math.
Me neither. Me neither at all. But I go for 20 years.
You ready?
Yeah.
30 million years.
Oh my God.
Wow.
I know. That's when I read that. It was like, this comes out of the book Ghost from the Nursery. I
Right.
read that and I thought, what's going on in there? You know, when you think about when we think about kids in early childhood centers, if you could almost have X-ray vision and look into their little brains, they're on fire with all this activity. And they need nurturing and they need the things that will allow that activity to happen.
And you know, all the time when I'm out in the store, I watch, and it is so common to see a child that age in a stroller or in a shopping cart, and mom or dad are on their phone,
Yes.
not paying the slightest attention to what the child needs or is doing,
Yes.
while that little brain
Yes.
is making all kinds of connections.
Yes. And then creating the beliefs about how important am I?
Mm.
How can I count on my parent? I mean,
Right.
that just,
Right. And if those, those children are reaching out or they're trying to look at you and they're trying to get your attention and you're not attuned to that, what
yeah,
we've learned is children stop reaching out,
Right.
yeah.
so it's really important, especially that first year, that we're really in tune with children and their needs.
Makes me think I forget his first name, but Tonic, who did the still face with
Yeah.
children when they instructed mothers to have no facial expression when they were interacting with their little one or the infant. These kids got desperate to try to get their mother to pay attention.
Yeah.
And then Suzanne, that story about when we were talking about the story about reaching and I don't know that whole idea of what happens to kids when they get discouraged.
Yeah. Yeah. Even things like if you were young and you kind of were standing up and you felt really proud and somebody insulted you or shamed you, you start to slouch. And like trauma gets embedded in our posture even. So it's just we all as parents, as early childhood providers, just a renewed sense for this attachment period. I feel like it was popular and then it kind of went away. I know in the childcare world in early childhood, we focus on pre-K and school readiness. But by the time 3 happens, by the time you're verbal, you're basically cooked.
Right.
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 And we really need to focus on these early years. And I think
Right.
that's the headline.
Yeah, I
Well,
want to underscore, Diane, what you said. People should look up the still face experiment that's on
Yeah.
YouTube.
Yeah.
And it just says everything about what we're talking about. And this is a little child. The child's probably what, 18 months old, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can watch how disturbed she becomes because her mom isn't doing anything bad to her. Her mom is just not responding,
Right.
just like a mom on a cell phone.
Right.
Yeah.
We know what like violent abuse of children is horrible, but in some ways, by not knowing some of this and not knowing that our job is to help wire brains of children and do it through nurture. I mean, this comes back to the idea of what nurture is all about and being able to bring that in. I want to just say really quickly too, as we often do this, we pad things, we predict, acknowledge, disclaim some things. As we're having this conversation, I want to assure people that if you didn't know this, guilt can come in, shame can come in when you start hearing, I didn't know that. Does that mean I've hurt my child? And to be able to say, now that when you know better, you do better. I think that's Maya Angelou's statement. So just as a cautionary to not take this to a place where it's about making people feel guilty or ashamed.
Sure.
And so that idea too, I think, is so applicable to how we talk not just about ourselves with regard to guilt and shame, but what we do to other parents.
Yeah.
Parent shaming, mother shaming, and blaming is rampant.
Yes.
So let's talk more about this when we come back from our break. Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. We're talking with Diane Wagenhals and Suzanne O'Connor, and we'll see you after the break.
If you are a professional who would like to know more about how to provide care for individuals who have experienced trauma and adversity, Lakeside Global Institute can provide you with one of 2 intensive certification courses. You can be certified as a trauma-sensitive professional, which is a 50-hour online training experience. Or, for a deeper experience, you can become a Lakeside Global Institute certified trauma competent professional through a live Zoom process that is 75 hours of well-researched and practically applied training. Lakeside Global Institute provides professionals with the highest level of training sophistication and integrity for you to be proficient in trauma-responsive care. You can learn more by going to lakesidetraining.org for more information. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. Sandy, Sarah, and their guests will discuss strategies and innovative practices for restoring our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. We're going to continue our conversation now with our guests, Diane Wagenhals and Suzanne O'Connor from the Lakeside Global Institute.
Early childhood programs play such an essential role in supporting working parents and providing opportunities for cognitive, social, and emotional growth for children at really critical time in their development. What's it look like to bring trauma-informed practice to educators in these settings?
Fortunately, it's not that hard. The field has come quite a long way. They have invested a lot in social emotional learning, but that really focuses on the child and the outcomes and how to teach them to regulate. And I think what it means to bring trauma-informed care is really, everything that we know now about the lower brain and the amygdala, and that really our behavior, comes from that place. That attention-seeking behavior, some of this challenging behavior, it's actually attachment-seeking behavior. And connectedness regulates children. What gets in the way of that, I think, again, our culture and seeing some of these practices in place might look like we're spoiling the child. So, as a field, we have to, grow our confidence and know that, what we're learning now about neuroscience and some of the interventions that are taking place because of this information is really powerful. It makes your job easier. It makes your life easier. So, an appreciation for attachment. And then another area that we study in early childhood, but it really needs a big spotlight on it, is sensory development, which, that critical window is when you're infant toddler. And you really have to have a good full sensory development before we can really self-regulate. And, given the pandemic, and that the babies that were born or young during that time, missed out a lot on some of that sensory development. We didn't have childcare. We're just we're keeping our kids safe. And so without that exposure to not just the 5 senses, but proprioception and vestibular and interoception, we were learning that in childcare programs, by the age of 3, you're usually toilet trained. But that's not the case. Head Start centers are trying to find changing tables and put them in pre-K rooms. Language delays. So early intervention, they have a lot of referrals right now. So, but the good news, right, and is that there's neuroplasticity. We can rewire the brain. We can, not just for children where we suspect maybe there's been trauma and adversity, but all children would benefit from an environment that was rich in sensory activities and with staff that knew how to co-regulate. That's, part of how I affect children in a classroom is how I am. If I'm nervous and jumpy and I'm telling everybody to calm down, but I'm like this, that's not really going to work. And what Bruce Perry says is a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child.
Right.
And so it comes back to, doing your own work. And that's really hard because it's personal. But this is business, right? And so there's a little bit of tension there, and I think we have to move on from that.
I love the way you described this. The term that came to mind for me was like, these are just good universal precautions,
Yeah.
right? The way that we think about public health and like just things that we do so that they have a positive impact on everyone.
Yeah.
And what you were also describing with regard to the being regulated and doing that sort of self-focused work also feels so important. What are some of the strategies that you bring to this work that might be different from how we think about traditional education strategies? And I really appreciated the point you made about like we have this sort of mythology that preschool is for education, that we're teaching them rather than like really supporting their development.
Right. So I'll pick up on the sensory development piece. In a childcare environment, in a classroom, you will find typically a sensory area with puzzles. And really brave childcare teachers actually have sand and water tables. But for children that might be having challenging behavior, they're not allowed to play with that, when actually it's sensory input that they need. So really rethinking children's needs is really important. And then, traditionally we take a top-down approach when it comes to discipline. We have rules, and if you don't do the rules, these are the consequences. And what we are promoting is the bottom-up type of approach. I know we talk a lot about Bruce Perry, but he's really has helped, I think, us articulate what it means to be trauma informed with very young children. Like, what exactly are we talk about? Because when we think about therapies and helping children, there's play therapy, which is verbal, but for very, very young children, what do you do? And so it's around these sensory attachment types of interventions, rocking in a chair. Every childcare classroom, even pre-K, everybody needs to rock. So thinking more intentionally about how we regulate ourselves. And then I would say how we intervene in play needs to change. So in a pre-K classroom, a little child will make a gun out of a graham cracker. And how do we deal with that? And typically we're like, no guns in school, and we'll distract. But in many cases, a lot of children, when that intense play happens, they're actually reenacting post-traumatic play. And if we shut that down and make them feel shame, I really think, and Sandy, I've talked to you before, this is the beginning of serious mental illness.
Right.
When at a very young age, you're shut down, you can't express yourself. You learn to hide it, you sneak it, you lie, the shame, the self-medication that has to go on for you to feel normal. And so getting to understand how you intervene in that play is really powerful. You can go in and narrate it. You can go in and maybe save the day, which is really good because then that creates space, and the idea that you can recover, that good things do happen when there's struggle. So teaching those kinds of interventions, and some places do it. In Australia, I read a study where they actually teach pre-K teachers play therapy, and they have amazing outcomes. So these aren't new things, but unless we advocate for the critical nature of this first couple years of development, that's the only way we're going to be able to get more investments.
You know, what most people who are listening to this probably won't know about is that all of our fields of psychology, psychiatry, social work, and childcare got taken over in the beginning of the 1950s by a guy named John Watson, who was a behaviorist. And he said very clearly, children do not need love. And you can just basically put them in a box and they will
Bonkers.
grow up. And we are still profoundly being impacted by those really false behavioral notions that include punishment and include hurting kids, that somehow that's going to bring about some kind of positive change, which it doesn't work for me, doesn't work for my dog, makes no sense at all. And yet that's
But there's a lot of pressure that parents feel in any given moment. And I can tell you that going out with 5 under 5, I feel like eyes are on me. And so when one of them is pulling stuff off a shelf in the store and the other one is running up and down the aisles, it's, one, hard to stay regulated. And two, you feel a little desperate. And so this idea of, what does appropriate discipline look like? How do we do it? How do we do it in a way that isn't shaming or shutting down the actual opportunity for attunement and learning? That's really hard in the context of what we were sort of talking about before at the end of before the last break, about shame and judgment of parents. And that seems to play so much of a role too.
So Diane, I think, what she teaches parents and what we're now teaching early childhood providers is actually, now I'm just, I always say I'm just a pre-K teacher. That's my love. If I could pick anything, I'd love to be in a room all day with them. But what I learned from Diane, who learned from Naj, was this idea around contextual family therapy and around making amends. So Diane, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what that could look like for a parent in these situations.
Sure. Having almost, I like a book called, it's a book by Barbara Collett Rosa saying kids are worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And having a philosophy of parenting, if you think about what is your philosophy? And in it, she says, if it's not life-threatening, morally wrong, or dangerous, you can work with children.
Yeah.
And so that split-second decision, what do I have to do here when your child is doing something? If you use that as, no, it's not life-threatening, it's not morally wrong, and it's not danger. Okay, I can now I can slow down and I can think of what to do. And having a belief system about discipline and wanting it to be an opportunity for a child to learn and to grow and to feel empowered that they can do something is this idea of helping kids learn to make amends. And even very young children can learn. If a child has clobbered another child on the head with something, to be able to say, your job is to make Susie feel better right now. So let's think about what can we do to help her? Can you go over there and get that cold paper towel to put it on her head, to give that sense that I can do something? I impulsively did something. Okay, you're a child, that's what they do. But that learning how, incorporating that as a disciplinary approach. And that's what we're teaching. And we're doing a lot of work now with our early childhood people in this area to give them different tools. And it's almost your philosophy then. My philosophy is, how do I nurture?
Yeah.
Nurture and then provide structure. But that if kids can feel loved and they can feel like they're nurtured, they're going to have a response that it actually grows their brains. It does all kinds of wonderful things for them. And I want to make sure we get a story in here too. Suzanne and I have talked a lot about this, and I'm trying to connect it to what we're talking about. But something happened when we went to the flower show about 2 weeks ago, watching, I happen to be sitting somewhere and I'm not the, right now at this point in my life, I can't jump up and do things. And I was watching a child, I saw a mom, and she had two young children. They looked like they were under the age of probably 3 or 4. One was, and they were at the top of the escalator, and the mom wanted to go down the escalator with her kids. Well, she's got these two kids, and I don't think they'd ever been on an escalator before. And so she sort of pushed the little boy, and he went a couple steps and he realized he was traveling on this, and he freaked out and he was trying to run back up, and eventually he got up and he grabbed her. And so what she made a quick decision to have her little daughter stay at the top of the steps while she went downstairs with us and helped him go down. So I'm looking at this little girl, and Suzanne walks over, and I went, this child, she's scared. And what Suzanne did, Suzanne, why don't you pick it up from there?
I said, hold my bags. And I went over to the escalator and I looked at her and I said, do you want some help going down? And she looked at me and she said, yes. And she grabbed my hand. It was just, I haven't held a little hand in a long time. And that's a long elevator. Those are scary elevators. And we made it down to the end. But, just in that moment, being able to help her feel safe. She wasn't threatened by me. I kind of used a high voice. So I think, quickly we were able to regulate her and get her to where she needed to be.
I was thinking about the outcomes that you want to see. And that's like a perfect example of, I was thinking about being in a grocery store and how every now and then you can watch, because in the grocery store, there's always stuff going on, right? And every now and then there is a person who is a Suzanne who spontaneously comes and helps the parent and helps the child. And if only everybody would do that, there wouldn't be nearly the kinds of challenges, the shaming that parents go through when little kids, they don't have the brain yet to do what we'd like them to do. What other outcomes do you hope to see?
I think, aligning more opportunities for parenting education, and even providing those opportunities in childcare programs. We've done that. We have programs where we have childcare teachers and parents learning together, and building that alliance. So more group parenting education, a lot of funding right now for home visiting, but it's actually a little bit cheaper and tons of benefits when you bring parents together.
In Australia, I have a friend who shared with me that it is a universal practice to have women who've just given birth join a mom's group where they're assigned a nurse, and they all get together, once a week with their babies and the nurse and each other. And they have, opportunities to learn about what's happening with their babies, observe each other and support each other.
Yes.
And it's a universal precaution, right? In our systems, it's often only people who are identified as like somehow at risk, who are able to access that kind of support. And often there's a lot of, stigma attached to it, because there's an expectation that we're supposed to be born knowing how to parent.
It's our independence. It's our culture. We don't need anybody.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's really time we realized how dysfunctional our culture is and the messages that we're passing on, particularly to parents, because as we've talked about, that's going to affect the next generation and the next and the next and the next. And so forth.
We have a responsibility and an opportunity. And the information is there. It's the inspiration that we need to be able to bring to all of this. And we need to nurture parents while we're helping them learn about what nurturing is all about. So it's many levels, but this whole concept of nurture and how to bring that into early childhood, into families, to bring it into ourselves. How do we nurture ourselves? And how do we create environments of nurture? We can do this though. It's doable. We've seen it. We've
Well said,
experienced it.
Diane.
Oh, good.
Thank you both so much for
You're
joining us and being part of our conversation today.
Absolutely. Thank you so
We-
much for having us.
We've loved talking with you. Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. We just heard from Diane Wagenhals and Suzanne O'Connor from Lakeside Global Institute Educational Network. Join us next week to continue our explorations when we discuss how culture and complexity manifest with Dr. Robert Anda, one of the primary investigators of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and Dr. Laura Porter, who is helping communities figure out how to use that ACEs information to expand the social health of their communities. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.